Welcome to our introduction to the Mishneh Torah of Harambam Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. The Mishneh Torah is perhaps one of the most classical books of halacha, of Jewish law, and is in fact a synopsis of the entire oral tradition, the entire Torah Shebaal Peh, that the Rambam wrote in order for every Jewish person to be able to access and know both the practical laws of Judaism as well as all of the knowledge of the text, the various texts of Torah Shebaal Peh, which are included in the Talmud Bavli, the Talmud Yerushalmi, and all of the Midrashei Halacha that are found in the various texts of the Midrashim. With no further ado, let's begin the introduction that the Rambam himself writes to this most monumental and important work. Kol ha-mitzvot shenitnu lo leMoshe b'Sinai. All of the commandments that were taught to Moshe at Har Sinai beferushan nitnu. They were taught with their explanations. Shneamar, and we know this from the pasuk itself in Sefer Shmot, Perek Chaf Daled, chapter 24. Ve'etna lecha et luchot ha'even v'haTorah v'hamitzvah. Hashem says, to Moshe, I will give you these luchot ha'even, these tablets of stone, v'haTorah v'hamitzvah, the Torah and the mitzvah. What do these three expressions refer to? Torah zo, Torah shebichtav. The word Torah refers to the written Torah scroll that we have, the text of the Chamishei Chumshei Torah. V'hamitzvah, what does the expression v'hamitzvah refer to? Zo perusha, this is the explanation of the written Torah. Without the explanation, which of course is the Torah Shebaal Peh, it would be impossible to properly understand the Torah Shebichtav, and we would not be able to comprehend how to fulfill countless mitzvot. B'tzivanu la'asot ha'Torah al pi ha'mitzvah. We are commanded to fulfill the dictates of the Torah, the commandments of the Torah, according to the way that they are explained in the Torah Shebaal Peh. U'mitzvah zo hi hanikret Torah Shebaal Peh. As we just explained, this expression mitzvah refers to the Torah Shebaal Peh. The luchot ha'even, the word Torah, that refers to the written Torah scroll and the concepts of the laws and the laws themselves, but the practical application, which of course is explained to us in the Torah Shebaal Peh, is referred to with the word mitzvah, the word commandment, the way that we are intended to actually fulfill the commandments. Kol ha-Torah ketava Moshe Rabbeinu kodem shiamut bichtav yado. The entire Torah was written by Moshe himself with his own hand before he passed away. V'natan sefer lekol shevet v'shevet, and he gave one of these Sifrei Torah, or one Sefer Torah, to every tribe. The Sefer Echad nitanu be'aron la'ed, and one Sefer Torah was placed in the Aron HaKodesh, which subsequently was placed in the Kodesh HaKodashim as a testimony. That means that Moshe Rabbeinu alav hashalom composed, or not composed, but wrote, transcribed 13 Sifrei Torah before he passed away. And this is hinted to in the pasuk Shneamar, as it says, like in the pasuk in Sefer Dvarim, Lakoach et Sefer HaTorah zeh v'samtem oto. Moshe was commanded to take the Sefer Torah and place it in the Aron HaKodesh. V'hamitzvah shehi perush HaTorah. The mitzvah, the expression mitzvah, which we explained a moment ago, refers to the perush, to the commentary of the Torah. Lo ktava, that was not written down. Unlike the Torah scroll, which was written and preserved, the oral explanation was not written down, ela tziva va'ala zakenim, but rather it was commanded and taught to the zakenim, to the elders, to the chachamim that Moshe selected, v'lisha'ar kol Yisrael, and it was taught to the entire Jewish nation. Shnei Amar, as it says also in Sefer Dvarim, Perek Yud Gimel, the 13th chapter, Et kol hadavar asher anochi mitzaveh etchem oto tishmeru la'asot. The entire matter that I am commanding you to do, you shall fulfill. Umipnei zeh nikret Torah Shebaal Peh. Because it was not written down, it is referred to as Torah Shebaal Peh. Af al pi shelo nichteva Torah Shebaal Peh, limda Moshe Rabbeinu kula beveit dino l'shivim zekenim. And even though it was not written down, it was taught to the 70 chachamim, who are referred to as the zekenim, the leaders, the rabbis of Moshe's Beit Din. Now, although every word of the introduction to the Rambam's Mishneh Torah is significant and important, because it is quite lengthy, we are going to select specific paragraphs to focus on in order to gain an appreciation for this incredible book. ומימות משה רבנו ועד רבנו הקדוש לא חיברו חיבור שמלמדים אותו ברבים בתורה שבעל פה. The Rambam continues to explain to us the history and the development of the transmission of Torah Sheba'al Peh. From the time of Moshe Rabbeinu until Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who lived in the time of the Roman conquest of Eretz Yisrael, the Torah Sheba'al Peh was not written down. Ela b'chol dor v'dor, Rosh Beit Din, O Navi Shahaya Be'oto Hador Kotev La'atzmo Zichron HaShmuot Sheshama Merabotav. But rather, the rabbinic leaders of every generation would compose personal notes for himself in order to recall the details of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. V'hu melamed al peh l'rabim. And then he would teach the Torah Sheba'al Peh verbally to the public. But it was not to be recorded for posterity in the form of a written book. And this was always the case from the time of Moshe until Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, that it was not written down. However, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi had to change the entire history of the transmission of Torah Sheba'al Peh. V'hu kibetz kol hashmuot v'chol hadinim. He gathered all of the teachings and lessons, v'chol ha'beurim v'ha'perushim, all of the explanations, sheshamu Moshe Rabbeinu, that Moshe learnt from Hashem, v'shalamdu Beit Din shebechol dor v'dor, and that were taught in every Beit Din, in every generation, v'chol ha'torah kula, all of the explanations of the entire Torah. V'chiber me'akol sefer ha'mishnah, and from all of these teachings, Rabbeinu HaKadosh composed the Mishnah. V'shineno l'chachamim barabim, he taught the teachings of the Mishnah in public. V'nigla l'chol Yisrael, and it was revealed and available to the entire Jewish people. Uchetavuhu chulam, and all of this was recorded. V'ribtzu b'chol makom, and disseminated in every place. Kedei shelo tishtakach Torah sheba'al peh miyisrael, so that the oral tradition would not be forgotten from the Jewish nation. Why did Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi do this thing of recording the Torah Sheba'al Peh, albeit in a concise form, but nevertheless, why did he record the Torah Sheba'al Peh if it was not intended to be taught by being written down? Why didn't he leave things as they were? Why did he not allow the transmission of Torah to continue in the way that it did for time immemorial, from teacher to student? Because he observed that the number of students were diminishing, and the number of tragedies and difficulties were increasing, and the Roman government, authority, etc., was increasingly gaining power and making it difficult for the transmission of Torah to take place. And furthermore, the Jewish people were being increasingly scattered throughout their exiles. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi composed one composition, the Mishnah, which is divided into 6 sections, in order to make sure that the Torah Sheba'al Peh would be preserved, so that the Torah Sheba'al Peh could be easily, quickly learned, and would not be forgotten. And he spent his entire days, he and his Beit Din, making sure that the Mishnah was taught publicly. We will see in just a few moments that the Rambam himself set out on the same goal, with the same goal in mind of preserving the oral tradition of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which he therefore set out to write a book, or which in this case is actually composed of 14 different books. But the overarching book of the Mishneh Torah has the same goal in mind: to preserve the Torah Sheba'al Peh from being forgotten, and to ensure that every Jewish person will know how to keep the law. We'll skip ahead now For the next several pages, the Rambam outlines the exact transmission of Torah Shabbat Peh from Moshe Rabbeinu until the end of the era of the Nevi'im, of the prophets. And then he continues from the time of the prophets and continues to outline exactly who transmitted the Torah Shabbat Peh until the end of the Talmudic era. This is actually a very important point. We're going to read all of the names of the Chachamim that transmitted the Torah, but it's essential to know that the Torah Shabbat Peh that we are studying in this text and that we have in front of us is actually the same traditions and teachings that go all the way back in an unbroken chain to Moshe Rabbeinu and ultimately to Hashem himself, who taught the Torah Shabbat Peh to Moshe Rabbeinu. The Rambam then continues, and he tells us as follows: Nimsa she'kula me'Hashem Elokei Yisrael. We find that all these teachings, the source of all of the Torah Shabbat Peh, is from Hashem, the God of Israel. Ve'inyan shnei ha'gemarot, and now we have to understand the concept of the two Talmuds. Ve'inyan shnei ha'gemarot hu perush divrei ha'mishnayot u'be'ur amkoteha. We explained that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi collected the teachings of Torah Shabbat Peh and wrote them down so that they would not be forgotten. But these teachings are sometimes ambiguous and not clear. Therefore, we have two Talmuds that were written, one in Israel and one in Babylonia, with the purpose of explaining the details and the points of these Mishnayot. Udvarim shenitchadshu b'chol beitin ubeitin mimot Rabbeinu HaKadosh v'ad chibur HaGemara. And the Talmud, which is also referred to as the Gemara, explains all of the enactments which were made as well by the rabbinic leaders from the time of the Mishnah until the time of the Gemara. Mishneh Gemarot, and from these two Gemarot, umin hatoseftot umisifra v'sifri, from the two Gemarot and from the midrashic literature, mikulam yitba'er ha'asur v'hamutar, from those texts we learn that which is permitted and that which is prohibited, hatameh v'hatahur, that which is spiritually pure and that which is spiritually impure, hachiyuv v'hapatur, that which is guilty and that which is innocent, or that which is obligated and that which is exempt, hapasul v'hakasher, that which is invalid for ritual use and that which is valid for ritual use, kamoshe hetiku ish mipi ish, just as was transmitted man to student, rabbi to student, teacher to student, mipi Moshe Rabbeinu misinai, from Moshe going all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. Gam yitba'er mehem dvarim shegazru chachamim u'neviim, and included in this text of the Gemarot is the different gezerot, the different decrees that were made by the rabbis, shebechol dor vador, in every generation, la'asod siyag la Torah, in order to make a protective fence around the Torah. And so we have these massive texts of the Mishnah, the Talmud Bavli, the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Sifra, the Sifri, the Midrashic literature. How is one to navigate through all of these texts and understand the practical halacha, the practical law, as well as to know the entire corpus of Torah Shabbat Peh? It seems like an almost impossible task. And therefore, the Rambam, skipping to the end now of the Mishnah, of the introduction to the Mishneh Torah, the Rambam explains to us that this is the purpose why he composed this sefer of the Mishneh Torah. Klal uvizman hazeh, nowadays in particular, this was written over 800 years ago. Takfu atzarot yiterot, there's been additional distresses and challenges, difficulties. V'dachka hasha'at hakol, and the time is incredibly challenging. V'avda chochmat chachamenu ubina nevonenu nistara, and the wisdom of our rabbinic leadership has been hidden. I think what he means by this is that people do not have great access to understanding many of the rabbinic books, the books written by the Chachamim, and therefore the Rambam explains again, skipping ahead for the sake of brevity, klalo shel davar, the ultimate point here is kedei shelo yehei adam tzarich lichibur acher ba'olam, so that a person shouldn't need any other book in the world, bedin midinei Yisrael, in order to understand the laws of Yisrael. Ela yehei chibur zeh mekabetz la Torah sheba'al peh chula. The Rambam has composed for us one book, which is actually 14 books. It's subdivided into 14 books, but one book nevertheless, that gathers together all of the laws of the Torah, ima takanot v'haminhagot v'hagzerot, along with the decrees and rabbinic enactments and customs that were established over the years of our exile, v'hagzerot shnasu mimot Moshe Rabbeinu v'ad chibur Gemara, from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu until the completion of the Talmud of the Gemara. The Rambam has written this one book, Mishneh Torah, to encapture all of these laws, enactments, decrees, and customs, so that every Jew will know the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral tradition. He will know all of the laws, and he will know every aspect of Judaism. Lefichach, therefore, karati shem chibur zeh Mishneh Torah. Therefore, the Rambam writes, I am calling this Sefer Mishneh Torah, which means a review of the Torah. Lefisha Adam koreh b'Torah shebichtav tchila, so that a person can first read the written Torah, va'achar kach koreh vazeh, and then afterwards can read this composition, v'yodea mimenu Torah shebaal peh kula, and he will know the entire Torah shebaal peh, ve'eno tzarich likrot sefer acher beinehem, and he will not need to read any other sefer. I want to conclude this short limud that we have done together with the following points. The Rambam envisioned his book as being the last book in the chain of compositions of Torah Shebaal Peh, but interestingly, that was not the case. There have been countless commentaries written on the Mishneh Torah to explain where the Rambam pulled his sources, and where the Rambam decided, how the Rambam, decided what the halacha should be in its application. As we know, the Talmud is replete with countless machlokot, with countless disputes and arguments among the sages as to how to apply the Torah and how the Torah should be interpreted according to the rules of interpretation that were given at Sinai. The Rambam's Sefer Mishneh Torah was not the last Sefer in the chain of compositions of Torah literature that go back all the way to Har Sinai, but it certainly became the backbone of our halachic system in the generations following the Talmud Bavli. And so one of the best ways, perhaps the best way, to become familiar with the entire corpus of Torah Shebaal Peh and familiar with the entire knowledge of Torah Shebaal Peh is to learn the Mishneh Torah. Although we don't always rule in accordance with the Rambam's conclusions in Halakha, as we know from the Shulchan Aruch, that the Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law written by Rav Yosef Karo in the 1500s, the Shulchan Aruch tells us that nevertheless, although the halacha is not always in accordance with the Rambam's conclusions, certainly the Rambam's conclusions have a profound impact on our understanding of halacha and on the halachot themselves. And so, while we may not be able to apply halacha l'maaseh simply from learning the Rambam, it is a tremendous accomplishment to learn the Mishneh Torah simply for no other reason than that we will become familiar with the Torah Shebaal Peh, and we will have a deep understanding of our traditions going all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. In terms of the practical halachot, even they are to a very large extent influenced by the writings of the Rambam and the decisions of the Rambam, and so therefore there is a great to'elet, there's a great purpose to learning the Mishneh Torah. I look forward to learning more with you in the future of the Rambam's Mishneh Torah with the help of Hashem, Be'ezrat Hashem.